Assalamu alaikum, friends of BookBytes, and welcome to this week's edition of BookBytes. I've had the pleasure of reviewing a hot off the press book by Adrian Basson and Qaanitah Hunter, Who Will Rule South Africa? The Demise of the ANC and the Rise of a New Democracy. I call this book nothing short of an expose, having just completed reading it. We've seen a lot of political material coming out in the form of, various books, material that's sort of, dare I say, lumped together just to inform the public. But this is different. This book takes the edge off political material because it's in your face, an expose that names names without apology. I'm looking forward to speaking to one of the authors this evening to really delve into the bare details of what this means. Having this sort of knowledge in our hands, but also what it means for upcoming elections and the role of perhaps the ANC, but also looking at how state structures in government have fallen apart. Has government really delivered on its mandate, and what this means for the future of South Africa and the votership? Adrian Basson is editor-in-chief of News24 and an award-winning investigative journalist. This is his fifth book. Qaanitah Hunter is assistant editor for politics and opinions at News24, an award-winning political journalist. This is her third book. It's an absolute pleasure to have you online this evening. Qaanitah, welcome to BookBytes.
Shukran, Jazakallah so much for having me.
Fantastic, like I said, expose. Congratulations on this book to you and your fellow author. There's a lot happening here. There's a lot I want to get through and sort of dig into your mind. But right off the cuff, and let's start up with this big overarching question: is states, are we dealing with a failed state? Let me ask that right out. Are we dealing with a failed state?
So South Africa is at the precipice of something, Shafinaaz, 30 years into democracy next year. And obviously the general elections next year coincides with that very big milestone. And so the question is, with everything that's going on economically, politically, socially, is South Africa on the brink of a failed state, or are we there? And the answer to that simply is no, but we can be. We can be on our way there if we allow bad politics to continue unabated, if we allow politicians to run amok with this country, and that active citizenry does not play a role. Failed state, the difference between a state that is floundering versus a failed state is that you cannot assume mistakes in governments or failures and inefficiencies in the running of the government and running the state being tantamount to a failed state where people are not able to govern themselves, where there are no systems in place, where a country is unable to produce their own food, as we see in so many other countries, just in the continent, let alone elsewhere in the world. And so, to start off, there's one thing to be optimistic about, is that South Africa is not a failed state. The question is, can it hold on to this democracy for another 30 years? And I think that's where, when I say we are on the precipice of something, that's what I mean.
When we look at, sort of the failures you've encountered, I mean, I do appreciate that you've been able to outline that, okay, so we're not a failed state. We're not there yet. You do dedicate this book to people who are willing to fight for South Africa. So here we are sitting together in our own little sort of, hopefully consider this a discussion now that everyone will take hold of this book, read the book and decide what they want to do. We are willing to fight for our country. But are we a non-racial society? Are we establishing a growing economy? Are we a peaceful society? You bring up some of these questions in this book. Has government delivered, and where to from here?
Yeah, so if we look at the 1994 moment, it was obviously deemed a miracle in so many ways. The fact that South Africa was able to transcend that level of brutality of the apartheid regime and have this transition to democracy in a way that many deem was peaceful, a peaceful transition after obviously years and years of brutality. And so the idea then is that while there was political empowerment and political freedom, economic freedom did not follow suit in the same way. And that came with huge amounts of social problems when it comes to issues around crime, for example, when it comes to issues around land ownership, right? So 30 years later, you had a one party governance nationally. And what has that yielded for South Africa? This book was not meant to bash the ANC. This book was not meant to to pursue an argument that the ANC did no good for South Africa. This is a forensic account of where we are and what does that mean in terms of where we are going, because that's very, very important. You would know, Shafinaz, and I mean, lots of people ask me this question, ask each other this question. You know, what is the hope for South Africa? Where to from here? Is there any reason to be optimistic? And this is what this book seeks to do. It seeks to answer that question in terms of what is the future of South Africa looking like? And I can just break it down to you very simply that if the future of South Africa is the sum of its politics, it is heading to a treacherous path. But if it's a sum of the people that live here that take back the power into the hands of the people as envisioned by the democracy, the outcome is very, very different. And so democracy as we enjoy it today is not a prize that we can just sort of clap at and leave at that point. It's something that we have to actively pursue because there's efforts to actively undermine and subvert that democracy. And we see it in the levels of corruption, in the levels of misgovernance, in the levels of opposition to the rule of law. And so the idea then, the safety of your children, if you have to bring it down to that, the safety of your children, the future prospects of your children, all linked to what's happening today. And so the idea that this book advocates, and like you rightfully say, the dedication is to understand your role as a South African in the future of South Africa. As we sketch out to you, sometimes often very confused, sometimes very confusing political dynamics that have ensued and will ensue in the country.
I read this book as much as it is a kind of a challenge and a motivation for South Africans to take the power back in our hands. I saw it also, obviously, as a social document because it's very empowering to have the information in your hands. To have information like the scandal around Bosasa, what happened at Eskom, because we're dealing with load shedding on the daily, corruption and state capture. You outline each of these in very broad detail. Um, Take us back to some of these, because I mean, as much as we're looking at the pros and the positives and the way to take back, let's look at what really broke down state structures, what really happened. I want to just go back a little bit, step back and see the bare detail of what happened. Talk to us about some of that and the implications it's had to bring us to the point that we're at.
So we make the assertion in the book, Shafnaz, that corruption did not start with the arms deal and end with Zuma. But if you have to track the decline of the country, there's a kind of a date in which things went awry to the point of where we are today. And that date we pin being December 2007 when Jacob Zuma was elected ANC president. And there almost is a decline that you see in the politics, but also in the governance of the country. And so, if you track a lot of the progress that was made straight after apartheid under former President Mandela and under the Mbeki era, not to say that those periods were without flaws. Obviously, under the Mbeki era, there was an incredible consequence of his HIV/AIDS policy that was felt for years to come. But in terms of the prospects of the country, the robustness of our democracy, the our systems, our financial systems, and the growing economy, that South Africa was on an upward terrain, and then something happened, and South Africa started going downwards. In the last few years, there was an effort to obviously slow down that decline. But the problem with the decline of a country is that once you are on the other side of the mountain, the proverbial mountain, it's very difficult to slow down a decline. And so the idea is to unpack all of these things and draw the dots of the interconnectedness of everything. That ANC corruption involving Russian oligarchs plays a consequence years later on South Africa's position on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for example, or the fact that ESCOM, the problems with load shedding did not start today, and that actually one can pin it all the way back to um, the Mbeki era under Penwell Maduna, where ESCOM was not, the power stations were not serviced the way they ought to, or maintained the way they ought to have. Or if you look at the criminal justice system and the systemic um, breakdown that was enforced during the Zuma years, from the appointment of Menzi Simelane to the appointment of, your Sean Abrahams, etc. And so the idea is to make the reader understand the levels and nuance of the breakdown in South Africa, and to understand what rebuilding means. Because by dismissing problems by on one hand, or doing the extreme by just exaggerating the scenario where we are a failed state, there's nothing constructive in that. So the idea is to say, for our democracy to survive 30 more years, we need to identify what went wrong. And this is the lens that we wore in writing this book. What went wrong and what can be fixed. And so when you understand the optimism that South Africans faced when President Cyril Ramaphosa was elected, and you understand in the context of the disappointment people face or people have 6 years later, we break down what is the genesis of that. Why has there been inaction in so many areas, despite the promises of renewal, despite the promises of rebuilding the state after the Zuma years.
You also talk about, the importance of 2024 being just as important as 1994. Tell us more about that. Tell us more about the significance and what we're hoping to achieve as a country in terms of, regaining investor confidence and rebuilding the state, as you say.
You see, the problem that South Africa faces is the biggest threat to democracy is people opting out of democracy. And that's what not showing up to vote means. People have decided that democracy is not working for them and they are opting out. So therefore, you have to deal with the most awful consequences of not participating in one of the most participatory democracies in the world. South Africa prides itself with being a multi-party participatory democracy. So for that democracy, you have to actually participate. Now, when we make the assertion, some people say it's a hyperbole, some people say it's an exaggeration to say 2024 is 1994. There's many reasons. It's not the lens to say the ANC government is as illegitimate as the apartheid government was. That's not the assertion. The assertion is that just as 1994 was a moment of change, that had things not changed in 1994, the country could have slipped in a very treacherous path. Similarly, 2024 creates that moment. It's the moment of understanding that if things do that things are changing, regardless. So we can decide whether it changes for the better or for the worse. And that's the first bit of it. The second bit of it is that there's an entire generation, my age, 30-year-olds, who grew up without apartheid. So the link to the ANC it's not a link born in loyalty to a liberation movement. The third thing is, as we map out in the beginning of the book, liberation movements on the continent generally have about a 30-year lifespan, and then the decline is imminent. You saw it in Zambia, you saw it in Zimbabwe if the election was not stolen. So the idea then that you have a liberation movement transitioning away from a one-party stronghold, and we are entering a phase of coalition politics where no single party may get a majority, at least in two provinces, but possibly on a national level as well. That changes politics as we know it. And so the idea of 2024 being fashioned as a 1994, it's as important in taking charge of democracy, taking charge of your role in this democracy for it to withstand. Because if people did not believe in democracy in 1994, we wouldn't have had the country we had today. People did not come out to vote in their numbers, we would not have the democracy that we have, the constitutional democracy where we are all protected under. And so when we track, we make reference to a brilliant book in our book, a book that says How Democracies Die by two very clever academics. And they make reference to how the decline of liberation parties, the rise of populism, how we've seen examples of democracies on decline and what that means for economic prospects, what that means for the rise of mafia states, what for the rise of criminality generally. And so we are it's so we would be silly not to learn from the lessons, not only on the continent but the world, in this understanding this moment, in understanding this 30-year mark, and what does that mean for the future. There is already so much uncertainty about what are the prospects for our children, what are the prospects economically, how sustainable is the levels of unemployment, poverty, and inequality. Not sustainable. And so something has to give. And so that is the moment that we refer to in this book, and try to map out scenarios that kind of draw a picture of how this would play out.
As much as we talk about being one of the most participatory democracies, I mean, we look at 1994, you had voter turnout in massive droves, and this euphoria around having this opportunity to vote for the first time. And in 2024, you're not just looking at the potential decline of sort of support for this liberation movement, but massive voter apathy. Right.
Absolutely.
So how do we really test? How do we really test this participation? Are we really looking at now the failures of democracy? Because how do we test participation if your voter turnout turns out to be such of small numbers? What are we really testing here? Are we really testing support for liberation, or for the liberation movement that is now in its decline? Or are we really testing the failures of democracy in the next turnout? And this idea that somebody out there must just take the reins and do something.
I mean, let's look at 2021 local government election. For the first time, participation, voter turnout was less than 50%. I mean, that really is steep. If you just look at the amount of people that are eligible to vote and don't vote, eligible to vote and are not registered to vote, eligible to vote and don't vote, it's majority of the voting population. And so the fact that 15 million people show up to vote when actually there's about 27 million people that can vote is so problematic in terms of testing this democracy, and having a representative people-centric government. Because at the end of the day, we need majority of the people to turn out to vote. Participatory democracy doesn't start and end with voting, but it's an important and vital part of participatory democracy, and something that our liberation leaders fought and died for. And so the idea is not to say voting solves our problems, but it's the first step. Then you talk about participation in terms of your local council, participation in terms of when we understand what it means to have most of local government is functional. We live this. I don't need to preach to the audience of Salam Media. We live with a failing Johannesburg. We live with load shedding, and so the price of us not caring about what is happening politically is too high. and the connectedness of what it means for the overall future of South Africa is something that we have to realize. And so, I mean, this is just a snapshot. Obviously, the book goes into detail about what coalitions could mean, what coalitions, what are the pitfalls of coalitions, coalition governments. It's not about our assessment of whether this is good or bad. This is not about us saying coalitions are good or coalitions are bad. It is basically the future that actually a single party may not get a majority, and that can continue for a while until voters believe one party is worthy of running the executive by its, or the state by itself. But the reality of it is that we have to prepare for what is to come, and we have to understand how it is we got here, so that we are able to hold on to what the tenets of a democracy is, and build on that for the future of our kids.
You talk about, sort of taking back the state. What does that mean? What does it look like? Where to from here? You talk about a sort of new CODESA earlier this year, or a couple of weeks ago, and the potential for, as you've touched on, coalition parties, what that means, and a multi-party charter. Speak to us about some of that. What does the future look like?
So with the decline of single party dominance, as we've seen in the local government elections, where so many municipalities are run through coalitions, we understand that South Africa is in this new phase of coalition politics, and coalition politics is extremely messy and extremely difficult, and as we've seen in local government, affects service delivery and affects the most vulnerable of society. Now, what happens when this plays out nationally, when the ANC does not get 50 plus 1 on a national level? And what if that happens in provinces like Gauteng and in KwaZulu-Natal, where it's quite predictably going to happen? So the idea then is no single party can contest the ANC, to get 51%, 50 plus 1 of the percent of the vote. So what then happens? It means that either a coalition of of opposition parties come club together and they unseat the ANC, or the ANC plus smaller political party, depending on what percentage the ANC has, come together to form a government. Now, this introduces all sorts of dynamics, because we've lived it uh, quite closely in local government. If you look at the city of Johannesburg, for example, what a coalition agreement there looks like. If you look at places like Ekurhuleni, like Tshwane, and then in the smaller municipalities in northern KZN and in the Free State, you'd understand that, first of all, coalition politics has not been in the interest of the people. That it really has been in the interest of politicians making, wielding and wielding deals, and sort of making bets that are against positions and tenders. And so if this plays out nationally, the disruption that it has on national level is absolutely enormous. And so opposition parties have come together and said, if the ANC is majority, the ANC cannot continue governing, but the ANC can continue to govern if it sides with the EFF. And so an ANC EFF coalition will be disastrous for South Africa. And therefore, we need to come together as opposition parties to form a multi-party charter, to have an agreement to say we all contest elections, but after elections, we will work together to unseat an ANC EFF coalition. Now, that multi-party charter had 6 or 7 parties joining it together. If their best case scenario is 36% of the vote, that's still 15% less, percentage points less than what they need to elect a president, and who will then set up an executive. And so the idea then is to work on how do you deal with the phenomenon in South Africa, where you have a majority party that's on decline in the form of the ANC, but you're not seeing a rise in opposition politics or opposition parties. For example, the DA is polling late 20s, at best early 30s. That's not enough. despite the failures of the ANC. The EFF is sitting stagnant at between 10 and 15%. Best case scenario in some polls are 12%. And so that's the second and third biggest political parties. And then you have a huge fragmentation of opposition with anybody and everybody waking up and deciding that they could just run or register a political party. And then you have an interesting complication in the 2024 election, which is a ruling by the Constitutional Court that amends the basically results in the Electoral Amendment Act, which allows for independent candidates to contest for 200 seats in the National Assembly. So you have a province to national ballot, meaning elections as we know it changes. We're still waiting for the Constitutional Court to make a judgment, final judgment on that case. But the point is, voting as we know it has changed, and then politics as we know it has changed in the form of the introduction of coalition politics, and the fact that you have this wielding and dealing, you have this sort of cloak and daggers negotiations that we don't know what parties agree to, and parties that sometimes polar opposites. The fact that you have a party like Patriotic Alliance that is so sympathetic towards Israel, and a party like the ANC that is so sympathetic to the Palestinians co-governing in the city of Johannesburg is absurd. The fact that you have the EFF that is so vehemently against the ANC, yet they co-govern in Ekurhuleni with a small party taking the position of mayor. So what happens when all of this plays out nationally? And so the question is, how do you prepare for it? How do you make sense of it? And more importantly, how do you predict what ought to happen?
You've outlined so many of the scenarios here, and I'm thinking, I mean, we know of contenders for sort of, even in the case of a coalition, you would have the potential for Steenhuisen or Malema or perhaps even Mashaba to take center stage. But there's no sort of guarantee or immunization against the potential for any of these leaders putting personal benefit above forward movement or progress for the public. And so these are some of the pitfalls. And I think your book, your publication definitely raises these questions and these reflections for readers, for the general public in general. And I'm really, really glad that we have the opportunity to be able to take this, this forward in terms of just allowing people to think on ways and how to take on the fight and carry this forward and be more involved voters. Qaanitah, thank you so much for the time you've given us this evening. I know that this is going to be a power-packed couple of weeks for you as conversations rule through this book, and we look forward to seeing more of your addresses and conversations as you go forward with this. Wishing you and Adriaan Basson everything of the best for this publication.
Thank you very much, Shafinaaz, and I appreciate it. And I would love to hear Salam Media viewers and audience feedback on the book. And I do think that if there is a single message of this book, is that we are not the sum of our bad politics. South Africa is bigger and better than that.
So it's absolutely possible to take back power and to take back an absolutely brilliant country for ourselves and for our people.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Thank you so much once again. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And there you have it. We spoke to author and political journalist Qaanitah Hunter about Who Will Rule South Africa, the demise of the ANC and the rise of a new democracy. Do get your hands on a copy and be part of the new revolution. With that, that's it from us at the team at BookBytes. And until next weekend, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.